Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a little blue book. It is one of many little blue books that were produced in the early part of the last century, very popular in the 1920s, and lasted up until the early 1970s when the publishing company burnt down. This one happens to be number 372. Problems of Birth Control and Overpopulation, a Guide to Malthusianism, written by John S. Gams. We were on, this is part 3, and we last ended off with the end of chapter 3. We are beginning chapter 4, and it is on page 24. Chapter 4. 19th century Malthusianism continued. The preceding chapter has already suggested at least one of the ways in which Malthusianism affected the men and women of 1800. We can imagine venerable fathers urging their young radical sons, followers of Goodwin or Owen, urging them to make Malthus' essay their Bible. We can easily imagine how ministers called the attention of their congregations to the laws of God, as revealed to Malthus via a Scottish gentleman. Not only was Malthus' general theory heralded, but specific parts of his book must have been read with avidity. Book 3, for example, examines systems of equality. Goodwin's theories, Owens' plans, the Poor Laws, all these and other plans for ameliorating the lot of mankind. Malthus pricks with the keen lances of dialect and of his theory of population. I shall give a few quotations and summaries from Book 3. Some of these quotations, I dare say, were marked and reread by at least a few of those who felt that this business of helping the working man was all nonsense. Let him be honest, sober, chaste, industrious, frugal. In the first quotation, chapter 1, Malthus warns against the assumption that his theories apply only to a far distant future. To a person who views the past and present states of mankind in the light in which they have appeared in the two preceding books, it cannot but be a matter of astonishment that all the writers on the perfectibility of man and of society, who have noticed the argument of the principle of population, treat it always very lightly, and invariably present the difficulties arising from it as at a great and almost immeasurable distance. An event at such a distance might fairly be left to Providence, but the truth is that, if the view of the argument given in this essay be just, the difficulty, so far from being remote, is imminent and immediate. I would like to quote from chapter 2, in which Malthus courteously attacks Goodwin directly. Unfortunately, I would have to quote a section too large to be proportionate to the remainder of this chapter. Besides, I shall go into the Hazlitt-Goodwin-Malthus controversy in great detail at the end of this chapter. In chapter 3, Robert Owens' system is discussed. Of the two decisive arguments against such systems, as Owens' one is, the unsuitableness of a state of equality, both according to experience and theory, to the production of those stimulants to exertion, which can alone overcome the natural indolence of man, and prompt him to the proper cultivation of the earth and the fabrication of those conveniences and comforts which are necessary to his happiness. And the other, the inevitable and necessary poverty and misery in which every system of equality must shortly terminate from the acknowledged tendency of the human race to increase faster than the means of substance, unless such increase be prevented by means infinitely more cruel than those which result from the laws of private property, and the moral obligation imposed on every man by the commands of God and nature to support his own children. Chapter 4 shows the limitations of immigration, and in the following chapters Malthus discusses the poor laws. The quality of provisions consumed in workhouses upon a part of the society that cannot in general be considered as the most valuable part diminishes the shares that would otherwise belong to more industrious and more worthy members, and thus, in the same manner, forces more to become dependent. If the poor in the workhouses were to live better than they do now, this new distribution of the money of the society would tend more conspicuously to depress the condition of those out of the workhouses by occasioning them advance in the price of provisions. In the 7th chapter, Malthus proposes a gradual abolition of the poor laws. I have been accused of proposing a law to prohibit the poor from marrying. What I have really proposed is a very different measure. It is the gradual and very gradual abolition of the poor laws. The preceding quotations must have endeared Malthus to many good citizens who were afraid of the radical schemes of their contemporaries. But the prophet Malthus was not without dishonor in his own country. There were some idiots who thought Malthus was ungodly. At first it may seem surprising that a man who staunchly supported the then present economic system should be accused of atheism. It will be remembered, however, that the Creator commanded man to increase, multiply, and replenish the earth. It will also be recalled that the early part of the 19th century was filled with Napoleonic wars as a natural result of God's commands and military needs. Malthus's advice to marry late or not at all must have been received with misgivings in some religious and all military circles. Thus far I have discussed the opinion pro et con towards Malthusianism of those members of society who wish to perpetuate the glories of 1800 forever and ever. I shall now discuss Hazlitt and Goodwin as being typical of radical opinions. Hazlitt, who has been quoted as already been seen to be strongly against Malthusianism on grounds of pity in part, and also on grounds of general perversity. He understood the theory of population quite as well as economists understood it today. He saw that the double ratios, even though inaccurate, described a condition which was very real. He protested, however, against the implications drawn from the double ratios. Malthus' theory, also attacked by Hazlitt in various ways. When the theories are not attacked, the man is. Malthus is accused of plagiary and hypocrisy. But the most interesting criticism made by Hazlitt is the refutation of Malthus's attack on Goodwin. It will be remembered that the essay on population was first suggested to its author as a reply to Goodwin. Goodwin himself made a reply to Malthus, but, as will be brought out later, the reply was weak. Hazlitt did better on Goodwin's behalf than Goodwin himself did. He states first the position of Malthus. For, so argued the author of the essay, let the principles of Mr. Goodwin's inquiry and of other similar works be carried literally and completely into effect. Let every corruption and abuse of power be entirely got rid of. Let virtue, knowledge, and civilization be advanced to the greatest height that these visionary reformers would suppose. Let the passions and aptitudes be subjected to the utmost control of reason and of popular opinion. Grant them, in a word, all that they ask, and the more completely their views are realized, the sooner will they be overthrown again, and the more inevitable and fatal will be the catastrophe. For the principle of population will still prevail. The number of mouths to be fed will have no limit, but the food that is to supply them cannot keep pace with the demand for it. In this state of things there will be no remedy. The wholesome checks of vice and misery, which have hitherto kept this principle within bounds, will have been done away. The voice of reason will be unheard. The passions only will bear away. And from the pinnacle of happiness, peace, refinement, and social advantage, we shall be hurried once more into the profounder abyss of misery, want, and barbarism than ever, by the sole operation of the principles of population. And now, says Hazlitt, what greater fallacy can be found than the preceding arguments of Malthus? Mr. Malthus concedes. He assumes a state of perfectibility, such as his opponents imagined, in which the general good is to obtain the entire mastery of individual interest and reason, of gross appetites and passions. And then he argues that such a perfect structure of society will fall by its own weight, because in the highest possible state of the subjugation of the passions to reason there will be absolutely lawless and unchecked, and because as men become enlightened, quick-sighted, and public-spirited, they will show themselves utterly blind to the consequences of their actions, utterly indifferent to their own well-being and that of all succeeding generations, whose fate is placed in their hands. This we conceive to be the boldest plagiarism that ever was offered to the world, or palmed upon willing credulity. Say that the utopian reasoners are visionaries unfounded, well and good. But to say that society will have attained this high and palmy state, that reason will have become the master key to all other motives, and that when arrived at its greatest power, it will cease to act at all, but will fall down dead, inert, and senseless before the principle of population, is an opinion which one would think few people would choose to advance or assert. 2. Without strong inducements for maintaining or believing it. So much for Hazlitt's defense of Goodwin, and now for Goodwin's defense of Goodwin. Goodwin was not nimble-witted. Instead of refuting the implications of Malthus's theory, the implications that vice, poverty, misery, and wars are necessary checks, Goodwin attacked the fundamental principle, the principle that population tends to increase faster than the food supply. This principle was irrefutable without accurate statistics, and in this day of accurate statistics it can be shown that Malthusianism probably operates, even though the operation of the double ratios need not frighten us. Consider the weakness of the part of Goodwin's reply. It has sometimes occurred to me whether Mr. Malthus did not catch the first hint of his geometrical ratio from a curious passage of Judge Blackstone on consanguinity, which is as follows. The doctrine of lineal consanguinity is sufficiently plain and obvious, but it is at the first view astonishing to consider the number of lineal ancestors which every man has within no very great number of degrees. Of these he hath 2 in the first ascending degree, his own parents. He hath 4 in the second, the parents of his father, and the parents of his mother. He hath 8 in the third, the parents of his 2 grandfathers and 2 grandmothers. And by the same rule of progression he hath 128 in the 7th, 1,000 in the 24, and 24 in the 10th. And at the 20th degree, or the distance of 20 generations, every man hath above 1,000,000 ancestors, as common arithmetic will demonstrate. This argument, however, from Judge Blackstone, of a geometrical progression, would much more naturally apply to Montenegro's hypothesis of a depopulation of the world, and prove that the human species is hastening fast to extinction. An ingenious sophism might be raised upon it, to show that the race of mankind will ultimately terminate in unity. Mr. Malthus, indeed, should have reflected that it is much more certain that every man has had ancestors than that he will have posterity, and that it is still more doubtful whether he will have posterity to 20 or to an indefinite number of generations. One more influence of Malthus on his contemporaries may be cited, and that is his influence on a theory of wages known as the iron law of wages. The theory of Malthus is combined with the Ricardian theory of rent, formulated the following law. The natural price of labor is the price which is necessary to enable the laborers one with another to subsist and to perpetuate their race, without either increase or diminution. Concerning this, I quote from the Americana. If wages rise temporarily, population will tend to increase, and this will cause a fall again in the rate of wages. Nor will it help the laborer. Nor will it help the laboring class to exercise thrift or self-restraint, for then wages will fall to the new level necessary for their subsistence. The remedies proposed by Ricardo himself were the abolition of the poor laws and the development among the laboring class of a higher standard of living. Chapter 5. Malthus and Economic Theories. In the foreword of this booklet, it was stated that the significance of Malthus lay not in his principle of population, which has sunk into desuetude. It lay rather in the fact that Malthus was typical of his day, a typical political economist. He was a reputable professor in a reputable university, and this means that he shared the reputable view of his time. Some of these views are still with us. Others have been abandoned by professors, perhaps unwillingly, as progress was made in methods of investigating social and economic problems. In any case, the preconceptions without which Malthus' work had not taken shape have bulked large in economic thinking. The purpose of this chapter is to separate and discuss some of the currents of economic thought which flowered around Malthus, and which were and are more or less acceptable to economists. Such a procedure as the one here proposed will lead to a discussion of the history of economics. In no respect with Malthus more typical of his age, and of all times, than in his urging the labor to save, to be industrious, and in general to raise himself by his own bootstraps. It is not fair to regulate the philosophy of thrift to the times of Malthus, Mr. Veblen calling this philosophy a body of maxims of expedient conduct, notes that there is scarcely a degree of advance in this philosophy from Confucius to Samuel Smiles. Frugality is still the worker's chief virtue, as evidenced by sermons, speeches, commencement exercises, and inspirational talks in general. We are even horrified to learn that workers, during times of moderate prosperity, do not hoard against the inevitable day of unemployment, we refer to the buying by workers of luxuries as the silk shirt craze. In the last 150 years, the philosophy of thrift has had two eminent representatives, Benjamin Franklin and Samuel Smiles. Franklin was the venerable contemporary of Malthus. Smiles' long life included the first few years of the 20th century. One of these two has suggested that a man should always be working and improving himself, and that even the time one spends by the river enjoying the scenery is lost and wasted. Benjamin Franklin, as every American knows, edited an almanac in which the droll philosopher Poor Richard urged readers to go early to bed and to arise early in order to attain to health, wealth, and wisdom. There were many maxims exhorting thrift and good habits. God helps them that help themselves. He that drinks fast pays slow. Silks and satins, scarlet and velvet, put out the kitchen fire. He that by the plough would thrive himself must either hold or drive. Such sayings were published in numerous books. One was called The Way to Wealth. Those who have read Franklin's autobiography will remember the delightfully ingenious method of accounting used to make a memorandum of vices and virtues. Such a keeping of records, coupled with a philosophy of thrift and industriousness, is evidence that Franklin, like Malthus, believed each man the architect of his own fortune. There are some ways in which Malthus' economic affiliations are more important to the student than in the way just mentioned. His philosophy of thrift is interesting enough, but Malthus was identified with the laissez-faire of his age, a far more important affiliation than his affiliation with Smiles, Franklin, or Confucius. Laissez-faire, which is, in French, the imperative of let alone, takes its name from a bit of advice given to Colbert. Colbert had asked a merchant concerning the needs of an industry. The merchant answered in effect, "Don't bother us businessmen, let us exploit the world as we please," or as the French have it, laissez-faire et passer, le monde vit le même. Sorry for the interruption. If I repeat here, it's because I've sort of lost place. I'll try and start over again. Those who have read Franklin's autobiography will remember the delightfully ingenious method of accounting used to make a memorandum of vices and virtues. Such a keeping of records, coupled with a philosophy of thrift and industriousness, is evidence that Franklin, like Malthus, believed each man the architect of his own fortune. There are some ways in which Malthus's economic affiliations are more important to the student than in the way just mentioned. His philosophy of thrift is interesting enough, but Malthus was identified with the laissez-faire. Oh God, I really went back, didn't I? Okay, let's see if I can catch up here. There's let us exploit the world as we please, let alone the world revolves. Okay, or as the French have it, laissez-faire, let alone the world revolves of itself. As an economic theory, it is to be associated with the physiocrats, followers of Franciscus Cuisenaire. Laissez-faire is probably the first consistent economic policy, domestic or foreign, of which we have record. Except mercantilism. Like all theories, it had its roots in certain economic and social movements. In this case, the greatest movement was the birth of large-scale production, the infant industrialism. It must be remembered that less than 150 years ago, machine production was in its early stages, but it was growing fast. Civilization had never borne such an offspring before. Lusty, breathing, smoke-consuming women and children. What could one do about such a prodigy? Nobody knew. Laissez-faire, someone had had someone advised, no better advice was available, and so nobody did anything. The prodigy gluttoned nobles, created slums, introduced new diseases, consumed more women and children, but what could one do? Where was the nursemaid who could calm him, or the father who could give him a good spanking? If I had given the impression with my clumsy metaphor that industrialism was at bottom an innocent child, even though sometimes a little unmanageable and pettish, I want to change that impression. Nor do I mean to imply that laissez-faire as a policy towards industrialism was a result solely of ignorance. No doubt many manufacturers were fully class-conscious when they advocated that government keep its hands off and that no attempt be made to regulate profits or the hours of workers. Nonetheless, it is no doubt true that laissez-faire had part of its background in ignorance or helplessness before new and startling economic conditions. People did not know what to do. They were facing something the like of which had never been before on land or sea. I am rather of the opinion that even today ignorance, as much as dishonesty, prevents us from correcting many evils. The railroad nuisance, for example, how can it be abated? And I think I'll stop there.